Now, mold has spores that it releases off. Think of mold like a tree, okay? So the leaves that would fall off of a tree, let's say that's the spore of the mold colony, okay? But there's so much more of the tree. There's the bark and the roots and the branches and all this stuff, right? All of that stuff, if you breathed it in, would still trigger the same immune response because it still has the same DNA signature and reaction that a mold spore would have on your body. Now imagine a gust of wind came by and shattered that tree into a teeny tiny million pieces. That's actually what's floating around in your house, not just the leaves. And so by being able to test the dust, we can do DNA sequencing that actually looks for the DNA code, and it's not limited by the size of the particle.
Welcome to the Soaring Child podcast, where parents of children with ADHD learn tips and tricks to help their child soar at home, at school, and in life. We feature interviews with experts, medical professionals, and parents just like you who are learning how to reduce ADHD symptoms using food and other natural strategies. Because children with ADHD deserve to soar just like every other child. I'm Dana Kay, your host. Hello, parents. This is Dana Kay here with another edition of the Soaring Child podcast. Last week, we started an incredible conversation with Brian Karr. Oh my gosh, we just got so much valuable insight that we really just couldn't stop talking. There was simply too much gold to share in one episode. So today we're picking up right where we left off. Now, if you didn't catch the first part, I highly recommend going back and giving it a listen. I'm going to pop the link to that episode in the show notes, or you can just search on your favorite podcast platform. Now, for those of you who are all caught up, let's dive back in and continue uncovering the critical information every parent needs to know about mold testing and keeping your home safe for your family. I think I want to get down to the nitty-gritty of home testing because this is I don't even know how long we've been talking, but I have to say this episode is just going to be amazing, and you've been such an amazing guest, but I really want to get to that home testing. If you, there's a couple of things here. If you suspect mold in your home, I don't want to go off and get some big, inspector to come out and pay all this money. Mm-hmm. What should I do?
Yeah. So think of it like your body. Like if you go to the doctor, you're like, I think I'm not feeling right. I think I might have something going on. The first thing your doctor does is they run some sort of screening test panel, right? They'll do some sort of blood screen test or something that looks for a whole bunch of things, and they'll try to see if anything jumps off the page that would then say, hey, this is weird. We should dig into this a little more, right? So what you want to do is the same concept. You want the same concept to happen in the house that you would do there. So you want a screening test. You want the test to be able to essentially let you know, do I have a problem? How significant is the problem, right? And, is it severe? Is it not severe? At least based off of this high-level screening test, like where am I at on some sort of scale? And how does that help me decide what I need to do, right? So that's kind of the goal of what we're trying to do here. So the way that you do that is through dust sampling, dust testing. Now, the reason that dust is the way that you do this is a few things. One, gravity brings most particles in your house, I won't say all of them, but most particles in your house down to the ground, to a surface, wherever it is. Dust is there. Dust then acts kind of like a spider web, if you will, and it holds it and it collects it and it keeps it there, right? So the first really big benefit of dust is that you're getting a really good sample set. You're getting a good historical collection of what's been floating around your house for however long it's been since you cleaned that area, right? And so you want to go find areas that you haven't cleaned very often, tops of door frames, under furniture pieces, whatever, because you want a really good representation. And dust is the only thing that allows you to get that. So that's the first piece. The second thing is that in dust analysis, you are able to analyze the contents of the dust in a more progressive way. Meaning, if you're doing an air sample somewhere, the way that that's looked at, it's basically like you suck air into this pump. It puts, whatever particle onto a little glass slide. Like if we remember, science class where you look under a microscope, you literally send that to somebody, and just like science class, they look under a microscope and they physically count what they see. Our eyes can only see so much. and there's limitations to that. Now, all they can look for is a spore in that thing. Now, mold has spores that it releases off. Think of mold like a tree, okay? So the leaves that would fall off of a tree, let's say that's the spore of the mold colony, okay? But there's so much more of the tree. There's the bark and the roots and the branches and all this stuff, right? All of that stuff, if you breathed it in, would still trigger the same immune response because it still has the same DNA signature and reaction that a mold spore would have on your body. Now imagine a gust of wind came by and shattered that tree into a teeny tiny million pieces. That's actually what's floating around in your house, not just the leaves. And so by being able to test the dust, we can do DNA sequencing that actually looks for the DNA code, and it's not limited by the size of the particle, which means you can see all the teeny tiny little particles that are there. And the reason that's important is because as you breathe, your body has like a natural filtering system in it, right, to protect your lungs from big stuff. But these particles are so small, they go right through it. They get right into your lungs and they go right out of your lungs into your bloodstream, and there goes the inflammatory response. So by testing in this way, you're actually getting a real look at what you're being exposed to, as opposed to relying on an air sample somewhere that's really limiting just your visibility into what's going on, and then can give you a false sense of security that you're not being exposed to something. Yeah. So those are the two really, really big benefits of dust testing. And so that's why we talked earlier that I'm also a co-founder of a company called The Dust Test, because we literally over the years have taken thousands of calls from people who wanted this, right? Like, how do I do this piece of what's going on? Now, there was already dust testing technology that existed. Okay. So in the late 2000s, like 08, so somewhere around there, I forget exactly when it was, but the EPA did a study across the country, and it's called the ERMI study, which is Environmental Relative Moldiness Index. And what they did is their intention was to go out and figure out some way to get an understanding of how moldy a house is and create a moldiness index of how moldy a house is. That was their intention. It didn't work as they intended. Unfortunately, nobody really understands it. So they think that it works, but it doesn't, which I can explain very quickly why it doesn't work. But there's actually two things that they created in that. And there's a really, really big misunderstanding on it. And this is like the first clarity piece to help understand where it's going. ERMI is not a test. It's actually not a test at all. It is an index, Environmental Relative Moldiness Index. It is an interpretation of data, okay? So now when you buy an ERMI, it's called an ERMI. They don't call it the EPA's 36 mold species panel, because that who would know what they're buying, right? So instead, they think they're buying an ERMI, but they're not, right? What you're actually buying is a panel of 36 different mold species that are being analyzed to understand at the species level what's there. So you have two pieces of an ERMI. You have the actual raw data, which is the mold, each individual mold and how many, what the count is. And then you have this overlay index that they lay on top of it to try to create a single score to try to provide some index clarity for someone on, do I have a mold problem in my house or not? Now, the problem with this is how they calculate that score. And this is what the core issue is. And this is why we created the dust test. So the score calculation, the way that this is set up, without getting too into it, the molds that are on that panel are split into two groups. They call one water damage molds, and they call two common indoor molds. Quick break, spoiler alert, every mold is a water damage mold. So to devalue certain mold types over here and say that they're not actually a problem is already a problem in how we interpret what the data means, right? So that's the first thing. Now, the second and probably the bigger issue with this is how they calculate their score. So let's just imagine in your heads, on one side you have group one side you have group two. I did this with my daughter, so I'm going to tell you how I did this, and it's going to make a lot of sense. So what I put in front of my daughter, my wife bought two different types of apples. She bought green ones and red ones one day. So I put in front of my daughter, I was like, here's a red apple. Here's a green apple. It's like, how many apples are here? She's like, there's two apples. I'm like, yes, there's two apples here. Great call, right? Now, what the scoring system of the ERMI does, and I'll explain it in a second, what they do is they say, here's a red apple, here's a green apple. How many apples do I have? They say 0 apples are present. That's what their math does. And so here's how it works. They take the group 2 molds that are found and they subtract that total from the group 1 molds, right? So if I have, 10 molds over here on one side and I have 10 molds over here on the other side, there's 20. That my body doesn't care which one it is. My body's reacting, right?
Mm-hmm.
What they're saying is they're subtracting one of the 10 from the other 10 and they're coming back and telling you 0.
Yeah.
And then people see this number and they're like, 0. My house doesn't have any mold problems. This is amazing. And they move into this house, or they do the test when they're already in the house and they say, oh, I don't have a mold problem. And then they go back to their doctor and they're like, I did an ERMI and everything says my house is fine. And the math doesn't math. Right? It doesn't make any sense. And so when we just see this over and over, we'd have these consult calls where we'd explain what I just explained like over and over and over again. And so we're like, okay, we need to fix this. And we have the ability to do it because we've done so many inspections that we can provide a different layer of context on what these dust samples mean. And so what we did, we kept the same exact panel of the molds, right? So it's all the same. It's all
same
what the
data
EPA developed, same data, same everything. And we just wanted to put a different interpretation on top of it.
Mm-hmm.
So what we did is we looked at all of our inspection data that we inspect, and we looked to find correlations between if your total, dust sample result was X, like what did this house really look like? Because we would know, we went in there, how many sources are here? Is there, what's going on in this place? And we created essentially like a percentile scale based on, kind of our reference data of where your house would land, with an understanding that we've actually seen a bunch of these and can provide some more real context on what it looks like. So when you get a report from the dust test, you essentially get all the species molds that's exactly the same, and it tells you all that stuff. But then the layer of interpretation is, listen, your house ranks in the 25th to 50th percentile of homes, which actually isn't that bad if you fell in that spot, right? Mm-hmm. As opposed to your house is in the upper 9%, like the worst 9%, then you would know, man, I probably got a whole lot of problems in this house, right? Mm-hmm. And when someone asks like, how bad is it? What they're really asking is for some sort of comparison to help make a decision. And so that was the driving force behind how do we develop a report that gives somebody something that they can make their next decision on. And comparison was our opinion on what that meant, because your question is, do I stay or do I leave, or do I do nothing, or do I have an inspection, right? So you need to have some sort of baseline comparison. Yeah. And that was the build, and that's how we built it, and that was the philosophy behind it.
And thank you for explaining that. I know that went into quite a bit of detail, but I just want to summarize for listeners. So at-home test, not created equal. Really where you want to focus is your dust test. There are a couple of options out there. We've got the ERMI, which is really not the ERMI. It's that the ERMI is the actual, what they're testing inside the dust. And so basically what you've done is you've gone and taken all that same data from the ERMI and you've put it in a proper report that's actually meaningful and can, guide you accordingly on what to sort of do next. That's one of the reasons we actually use and suggest the dust test for the families that we work with if we're suspecting mold. Thank you for explaining that. Now, one question I just want to touch on. So really, first port of call for families, if you're suspecting mold, do an at-home test. You don't have to go off and get a big remediation company to do the testing. Even they're not created equal. I don't actually think we're going to have time to actually dive into that today. Yeah. I wanted to touch on remediation companies and what they're doing in looking for mold at actual houses, but I just don't think we're going to have the time. So, getting that knowledge to start really can help you decide what to do next. Now, I just want to talk on if families living in different climates, just say you're in a really humid one versus a really dry one, does the approach does that change the approach? Like, obviously, we're gonna have probably a little bit more mold when we're in that humid climate.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because some people are just like, I'm going to move to Arizona and I'm not going to have a mold problem because it's the desert and it's dry, and it doesn't work like that, right? Okay. And so, while the climate may have some impact, it is not the most significant impact. From the most significant issues that we find in the house are moisture issues that happened inside of the house at some point in time, right? And that adds up over time. my sink was dripping over here, my dishwasher came out over here. Like all these things, they add up. It has nothing to do with the outside, right? Now, there are some things about being in a more humid climate that, you want to be aware of, right? A very, very big one is your heating air conditioning system. That's where I think your climate has the biggest impact on your home. And if you're not setting it up properly, then if your HVAC becomes contaminated, it's going everywhere through the house.
Yeah.
So the one very big engineering mistake that I've seen in HVAC builds in humid climates is something called a fresh air intake. And so what that means is that they'll actually pull air from outside instead of recirculating all of your inside air over and over again. And they'll say, hey, it's fresh air, it's outside air. You don't want to recirculate the stale inside air with the carbon monoxide and the X, Y, and Z. And like, in theory, it kind of makes sense. Like, okay, that makes sense. The problem is all the air outside is like 80% humidity. And so what you're doing is you're essentially pumping water into your HVAC system consistently. You're going to have mold all over that HVAC system in no time. And then it's going to start spraying through the house. So from an engineering perspective, do not have a fresh air. This is just my opinion. Don't have a fresh air intake if you live in a humid climate. And if you can avoid it, don't keep your air handler unit, which is where your ductwork connects to. It's the mechanical unit. Have that in a conditioned airspace in your house, not in the garage, not in the attic. Like have a closet, almost like a linen closet in your house, have a closet in there and have the unit in there, because now in your home, you're controlling the humidity and the elements, and you're not going to have it just living in a space where the humidity is 80% all the time. You've got to protect your HVAC system from the humidity. That is the biggest thing that I would say comes up with humid versus not. But outside of that, everything in your house is exactly the same, whether or not you live there or you live in Arizona.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because that, like some of the piece of advices that you've given throughout this episode, I can't think of another word than pure gold. I know I've said that a couple of times, but that's the only thing that's popping to my mind right now, because I think that you've just dropped these amazing bombs all the way through. Now, I should really end up this episode, but I'm actually thinking that we might have to split it into two, because I just got so much more I want to talk to you about.
All right.
And to let our listeners know, okay, so you've got mold, you detected on the dust test, how do you eliminate it? What do you then do?
Yeah, well, so the dust test is not going to tell you how to fix it. And I'm really glad that you did. It is, go back to the analogy of the doctor doing your initial blood test, right? Let's say, God forbid, you're somebody who has cancer and they find something in your initial, maybe your white blood cell count is really low, right? That is not going to tell you how to battle the cancer, right? That's going to tell you you might have cancer. That's what it's going to tell you. Then you have to dive into your body and do very specific diagnostics to figure out where it is, what kind it is. And then after that, you then put a plan together on how to treat it, right? Sometimes you could do chemo, sometimes it's surgery, and whatever it might be, right? It's no different in your house, right? Just think of mold of the cancer in your house that's growing in, places that you don't know what's going on, right? And so the dust test is the initial test that says your white blood cells are low, right? That's what the dust test is telling you. You got a problem. There's something going on here. Next step, additional testing to figure out where it is and what kind it is and what your plan of attack should be. That's where an inspection comes into play. So if you go through a dust test and you're like, okay, we have a problem, we now have to figure out where are the problems located, this wall, this ceiling, this cabinet, whatever it might be, HVAC system, all these things we talked about, and what kind of molds are there and which ones are the worst, right? The one thing that I do want to share before we wrap this, I know it keeps going long, so I apologize, but it's just because we find 15 areas of mold in your house, let's say, it doesn't mean that you have to remediate all 15 areas, right? Part of our process, we have this framework internally in the company that we call it RPM, but it's a remediation prioritization method, remediation priority method. And when we deliver our reports and our results, we don't just send here's your report, you have a mold problem here, and here's how to remediate it. We used to do that years ago because that's what we did. And then we started learning that, if we go in and find a bunch of stuff, the questions were always well, which ones do I need to do? Which ones are the most important? Which ones, because people don't know that. So we created this priority framework that we lay on top of all our reports now. And so it's literally a one-pager summary, every area that we did, and we tier it, priority A, B, C, D, whatever it might be. And then the conversation is again, you're never going to find every little spore or mold in your house. And if people are wrapping their head around that as being the goal, you're never going to get there. And you're going to create this persistent constant fear that will never go away. And I've seen it, right? What we need to do is, and what the true goal is to get your home to a level that meets your body's ability to be there. That's what we need to do.
I love that.
Some people can handle more. Like me, I can handle more. Some people can handle way less. So if we were in the same house, I might be okay in one house, but they might not be, right? So what we need to do is figure out where all of the problems are. I need to know where every single thing that I could possibly find is. And then I go through all of it and I'm like, all right, these are the top 4 things that I think are contributing to the most of what's going on. So if you're gonna attack this, attack it in this order. And let's reduce the biggest things first as we come down, with the goal of just meeting you at where you can live in that house without going nuts, without your body going nuts, right? And that's the goal. That's the ultimate goal. And so if you go back to the cancer analogy, I've done all this testing in your body and I've identified that you have a couple things that are going on. It's like, okay, but we think that if we attack it like this, we can do it without surgery and still get you to where you need to be, right? And that's the analogy on the other side. It's like, how can we get you to do as minimal work as you can, while also meeting the goal of getting the house to a point that's safe for you to be in, right? And so that's the idea. Makes
total sense. Now, just want to quickly ask, I said I wasn't going to ask you this question, but I have to. It's I've got to wrap this up into a nice, neat little package so our listeners have all the information. Once you've got this, data that, okay, there is mold, what are some of the key things people should look out for when choosing a professional to do that remediation?
Yeah, remediation's really important, right? Like you could have us come in and find every single thing and we write the remediation plan. Like we literally, like, here, just go do this. I wrote this up, just go do this. And again, go back to the medical side. Think of Grey's Anatomy. You got Meredith Grey diagnosing you, but you don't have Derek Shepherd doing your brain surgery. You have somebody who's been out of school for 1 year doing your brain surgery. Is that going to go well? Even though Dr. Gray was like the best at diagnosing, you get like somebody who's never cut open a brain before. Is it going to go well? Probably not. And so there really is this dependency on both sides for it to be successful. And so on the remediation piece, their job is to come in and execute a plan that's been put in front of them and to do it properly, right? Now, I would tell you this, I keep going back to medical analogies, but that's what this all is. It's for the house. It's the same process for the house as the body. If you are looking for a doctor who specializes in something really specific, right? And I'm sure this audience is, and what we're talking about, right? Then you're going to have like a series of questions and expectations of why is this one better than the other ones and more suited to do what I need them to do as opposed to anybody else. Yeah. And you have to approach the conversations with remediation companies the same way. Like for people that work with us, we actually send them a, like a PDF sort of guide on like how to sort of filter out and like ask the right questions and do those things to filter out remediation companies. But the really simple thing is like, do they know whatever your health issue is? Have they heard of it? If they haven't heard of it, they probably are not suited to work with somebody who has it, right? So like, that's the big thing. Like, my kid has PANS. Do you know what PANS is? No? Okay, cool. Because the process of a remediation for somebody who's hypersensitive, where minimal exposures are going to impact them, it's different. It's like going into it's almost like having like your regular house cleaner comes in your house and cleans your house. And then a biotoxin team comes into your house and cleans your house with all the suits and stuff, right? Like that's the equivalent. Most remediation companies are just like Molly Maid who shows up and just cleans your house that day. And they come once a month and they clean your house. Or you have somebody come in who is like in the suits and it's like the government coming in and like really making sure that you're not spreading disease everywhere, right? Those are two very different levels of cleaning. And the same concept really applies to the remediation side. So you got to make sure they understand what you're dealing with. They know what mycotoxins are. They understand the process. They see our protocol and commit to doing our protocol. I can't even tell you how many times they're like, you give it to them. And then it wasn't really like written that way in the contract that then was created between the remediator and the client. And then the remediator is like, well, we did everything in the contract. And the client is like, well, I gave you this report. Like, this is what I wanted. And because a lot of it is confusing, and if you really don't sit there and take the time to cross-reference everything, you can get like contractual things that come up and they're like, well, we did our job. And you're like, well, that's not what I wanted you to do. And then you're kind of stuck, right? Mm-hmm. So you really need to make sure that whatever protocol it is, our protocol, whoever you're working with, right, that they see it and they're like, we will do this. And we will write this down in our contract so we are all on the same page of what we're doing, right? And if for some reason they don't want to do it, that they have a really good rationale, maybe a different approach for how they want to achieve the same thing. And you can tell in the way they're speaking about it and thinking about it that, yes, like that, okay, I'm comfortable with that.
And now, is there any governing board or bodies or certifications that like may make a company stand out a little bit more?
There's certifications, they exist in our industry. I think they're kind of like crap. I don't think it means anything. Like, you can go get like an inspection version of a certification. All you need to do is take a test that takes like an hour and you could be certified. Like, it's not there. It's just not there. Right. So I know a lot of times, you want to have people that are certified, and I get that, right? There's the IICRC is a certification body. The ACAC is another certification body. So those are kind of the two big ones in our industries that will have various certifications for different disciplines within what we do. So there's inspection ones, there's remediation ones, right? So you could find certifications there. But I can't tell you like how many times, like, oh, well, this person's certified, and you go in and it's like, this is a joke. I mean, go back to the doctor analogy again. You got literally Derek Shepard, brain surgeon for the ages, who has a designation MD behind him. Or you got the new kid, Brian Karr, that just got out of brain surgery school. I have an MD. Our certifications look the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Does that mean that I'm him? Like, no, right? And so there's this level of vetting that we just have to do, and we can't rely on that alone.
No, well, thank you for sharing that. Well, this episode has opened up this can of worms, and I think, Brian, you've done an amazing job to catch most of those worms. Finally, what message would you just like to leave with parents who are concerned about mold and the safety of their home environment?
Yeah. One, I think you should be. Two, I don't think that it should overwhelm you and consume you. I've especially like I have kids too, and it's like you could really deep dive into like a dark place and have a lot of negative, anxiety and things that come from it. I will say that I have seen so many people get better. I've seen people in really bad ways get better. Sometimes it takes a while because it's hard. It takes a long time to figure out like what the problem even was. And then depending on how severe the problem is, it might be, it might be a journey. Like, it's not going to happen overnight necessarily, but it happens, and it happens a lot. And I've seen it a lot. That girl that I mentioned earlier with the NeuroQuant scan ended up being, she had like a couple other inspections in the house, and there just ended up being a massive load of mold in the attic above her room.
Yeah.
That was the big trigger for her, and nobody found it. And come in, find it, they get rid of it, and they followed up at some point in the future, and the brain scans had just like completely reduced, and it was so much better, right? I've heard these stories from our clients all the time. Mm-hmm. So yes, I think you should take it seriously. I don't think you should be afraid of it. It's very conquerable, and you just have to surround yourself with the right people, but it's very, very doable. And so it really wanted to be a message of hope that like this can happen. I know sometimes when you're in it, it feels like there's just no end to it, but I've seen it like so many times.
Brian, amazing. Thank you so much for diving deep with us today, sharing your major expertise, like seriously, guiding our listeners through this complexity of home mold testing. Please tell listeners where they can find and follow you online.
Yeah, so the dust test that we talked about, it's simple. It's thedusttest.com. And then my inspection company, which is called We Inspect, we are yesweinspect.com. Then I'm on Instagram at Mold Finders. I have a podcast called Mold Finders Radio. So those places too.
Amazing. Well, listeners, we've heard today the quality of the air we breathe in our homes can have such a big impact on our total health, particularly for our kids with ADHD. Mold is often invisible. But I think with the right knowledge, the right tools, we can definitely protect our families from its harmful effects. Listeners, thank you for tuning into this week's episode of The Soaring Child. I'm Dana Kay, your ADHD health practitioner. Keep on thriving. Thank you for listening to the Soaring Child podcast today. To learn more about how to help your child with ADHD soar using natural strategies, visit our website at adhdthriveinstitute.com and follow us on social media at ADHD Thrive Institute.